Hello guys, so this video is an attempt to clarify on what we discussed in the last class, right? During the last class, I attempted to explain the concept of maps, that's the array map method in JavaScript. Yeah, and I noticed that a lot of us were not really um, getting it, okay? So I decided to make this video to explain what's happening there, okay? So remember that we said in JavaScript, we have two types of variables. We have reference types variables and we have primitive type variables. Primitive variables are passed by values, or reference types are passed by reference. Okay, what that statement means is this. So I'm going to get rid of this now. When we work with primitive types, for instance, this is name and it's a string. Remember, a string is a primitive type, right? When we make use of this variable, all right, anywhere we make use of that variable, we are going to be interacting with the value of the variable. So if we say console.log name, we get Austin printed to the console. All right, so that would be the value directly. But if we have a function, for instance, I'm going to name this function get name. It will be a function first, and then that returns name. Okay, this is a function. Now notice when I say get name, what we get is this function itself. All right, it is actually a reference to the function. Behind the scene, what's happening is that this function, in fact, this declaration, right, behind the scene during execution is going to be broken into three parts. All right, maybe not literally, but um, theoretically, right, it will break into three parts for the purpose of this explanation. One, the name of the function, which is get name. Two, the reference number. And three, the function itself, which would be this. All right. But for primitive variables, it's straightforward. So let me comment this. For primitive variables, it's really straightforward. It's just going to resolve, during execution, it resolves to name and the value, which is Austin. All right. So when we say primitives are passed by values and reference types, function in this case, is passed by reference. What we mean is if you try to work with, or if you try to mention the name of the variable, right? If it is a primitive type, what you get is the value directly, right? In this case, Austin. So when I mention name, I'll get Austin in return. But if it's a reference type function in this case, right? When we mention get name, what we're actually getting is the reference to that value. All right. As opposed to getting the value directly, we get the reference to the value. All right. That's what happens with reference types. Okay. That's what happens with reference types. So, having explained that, let's go back to the code we had before. So, consider this code we have here. So, we have a function called add numbers. That function, when it's being called, we expect two values to be passed to it, two arguments, and that's why we specify these parameters. Okay. So what the function does is it receives num1 and num2, adds them together, and returns the result. Then we have another function defined here. So this is where you should pay attention. The add5 function is going to expect a function to be passed into it. All right. And what it does is it's going to call that function. Okay. And then it's going to pass 4 and 5 into that function as arguments. When the result is returned, it will add 5 to whatever result is returned. All right. Very simple. Accept the function, call the function with two arguments, 4 and 5. And whatever result you get from the call, from the function call, add it to 5 and return. All right. So at line 11, we're simply saying call the add5 function. All right. So let me get rid of the console log statement so that you can clearly see what's happening. All right. Call the add5 function. What's add5? This is add5 function. Right. You call it and passing this function called add numbers, and that's this function here. All right. So we're passing this function. Remember, add5 function expects a function to be passed into it. Okay. So we're calling add5, and the function we're passing to add5 is add numbers function. All right. And then inside of the add5 function, we're calling whatever function is passed into it. In this case, add numbers is the function passed into it. So during execution at line 8, what we have here will be add numbers, and we're going to pass two arguments 4 and 5, which is going to represent num1 and num2. We're going to add them together and return the result. So adding 4 and 5 together will give you 9, and 9 plus 5 will give you 14, and that's what add 5 returns. That's why I wrote 14 here, commented. All right, so I'll return the code back to how it was, and we know that add 5, when it's passed this function, is going to return 14. So if we log this to the console.log, we see 14 in the console. All right, so this is a very simple example. Okay, now I want to go further to explain this example so that when we go back to implementing the map function, everything should be very clear at that time. All right, so I prepared the diagram here, all right, to show you what happens, you know, in a more visual, way. Okay, now this is our code. This is the code that we wrote. Okay, and this is what happens during execution. All right, theoretically, this is just me trying to get you to understand what happens. All right, this is by no means the exact stuff that happens, but it will help you understand the concept. Right, so we create our add 5 function, and we create add numbers function. Add 5 function receives a function, calls the function with 4 and 5, then adds 5 to the return value, and then return the result from this operation. This add numbers function is going to receive 2 values, add them together, and return the result. Okay. So lastly, we call the add 5 function and pass in the add numbers function to it. So during execution, what happens is this first code we have here is going to result to this, what you see in this first row. So add 5 resolves to a reference. No, add 5, is created in memory, and it points to a reference, and that reference will point to the actual function. When this runs, this identifier, the variable identifier, is added to the memory, and then it points to a reference that points to the actual function. All right. Now, this is the most critical part where everything comes together. When we call add 5 function, this is the add 5 function call. All right, just depicting the add 5 function call. We pass in add numbers, and I told you that reference types, which functions are, an example of, are passed by reference. So when we say, even though in the code we said add numbers, because add numbers is a reference type, what is going to be passed into the function actually is the reference to whatever add number represents, which is this function. All right, so the reference is passed into our add 5 call. All right, and then this is add 5, right? So this function is executing now. So return what function? Note that this function is this reference now, all right, during the call. And then when we are trying to invoke the function that was passed in, is actually the reference, right? We're trying to now invoke whatever that reference points to, and in this case, it points to this function. All right. So we're passing 4 for num1, I'm passing 5 for num2, and then the function is going to run. So num1 plus num2, which is 4 and 5, will give you 9, and it returns 9. So this whole code you see here will resolve to 9, and it will be added to 5, and you get 14. 14 is returned, right, to the caller, and that's why this function you have here will resolve to 14. Okay, so that's what happens behind the scene. So having explained this, we're going to come back here and bring back our code. So this was the code I wrote. So I wrote this code to explain how the map functions behind the scene, right? So we all know how to create functions: function keyword, function name, then parameters. So these are the things we expect when the function is being called. All right. So we want to call this function, for instance, we have to provide an array. All right. So we have to provide an array. We could even pass the array directly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we have to provide a function. All right. And what happens is that that function that we provide is going to be called. So this is what we're doing here. This is a function call. So we call the function, but we're going to pass in the current item, because we'll loop through the array that we'll pass in, right? And then at every time we loop, this is a loop happening right here, all right? At every iteration of the loop, right, we're going to be passing the current item in the array, all right? We're going to pass it into the function that we would provide for the map v2 function, all right? So we'll pass it here, and then we'll pass the index, all right, the current index, okay? And then after the loop, because every time it loops, right, it calls this function, right, with the provided arguments, and then the return value is pushed onto this new array. Okay, and when this loop is done, we will return new array. All right, So here we can pass in any function. So let's just create a function here. All right, so create a function and let's just call it multiply scores by 2. All right, so call it multiply scores by 2. So the function, look at this definition we have here. We're passing 2 arguments, right? So the function is going to expect 2 arguments. The first one will be current value, and the second one will be index. All right, and then inside the function, so this is the function we're declaring here. So inside the function, we want to simply return current index or current value times 2. All right, so at this point, we're not using the index, but it doesn't matter. Return current value by times 2. All right, so what we do is, since we don't map, v2 is going to return something. All right, so this function here returns a new array, right? So we want to store that return value in a variable that we're going to call doubled scores. All right, so in the end, we want to log the value of double scores to the console. Now, what we should expect is that this array should be doubled and returned. So that's what we'll see. So 1 times 2 comes 2, 2 times 4 becomes 4, 6, 8, 10. So we expect to see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 in the console. So if we go back to the console, you see we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. All right. As simple as that. Because JavaScript already provides this for us, like this is being provided for us by JavaScript already, okay, by default, all right. Because of that, we do not need to create our own. So I can get rid of ours and replace this map v2 with that of JavaScript. But for the one JavaScript provides for us, right, we do not pass in the values like this. So the array would be here dot map, all right, and this should work. So if we go back, you see we still have 2, 4, 6, 8. Refresh, 10. All right. So this is array.map in a nutshell. All right. And in case you are confused by this whole function being passed, know that functions in JavaScript are first class citizens. So the way you pass normal number, strings, and stuff like that into functions, you can pass a function into a function. Okay. So you should know that. But if it looks too rough, you can actually separate the function. So I just brought that function out and then reference the function. Yeah. So functions are passed by reference. So if I put the function name here, I'm simply referring to this function. So during execution, what you see here will be replaced by this entire function. All right. So with time, it's going to make more sense. So if I refresh, you see that our code still works. All right. So this is array.map for you. If you are confused, you are not the first. Spend time to rewatch the video because there's no other way I would explain this concept to you. All right. So you spend time to watch the video. All right. Rewatch the video, and then you go online, read about it. So this is how I learn. All right. What I do is I watch a tutorial. It's not making sense. I watch the same concept, right, from another person. I hear another person explain the concept. I read another material about the concept. And before you know it, it starts coming together. All right. And then I understand what's happening and I can implement it myself. All right. So there are concepts that are very easy to explain. You do not need to, take extra effort because they are easy to explain. But then there are complex concepts, not really complex, but for beginners, they will sound complex. But when you get a hold of that idea, it becomes very easy to you. In the next video, we're going to learn about the reduce function. So see you in the next video.